There's so much happening in our world right now, such as the war involving Ukraine and Russia. However, you will hear in this next interview, there's been another type of war taking place that may go a little unnoticed. There's something that affects Canadians almost each and every day in a variety of ways. Here in Canada, we've heard a lot about green energy and the tactic of blocking new pipelines. Joining me now to talk about some of these issues between the Canadian petrochemical industries and the green movement is Michelle Stirling of Friends of Science. Michelle, thanks for joining us today from Calgary.
My pleasure.
Now, last time you and I chatted, we talked a bit about the money behind the efforts to keep Canadian oil in the ground and out of world markets. Has much changed in that regard?
No, people don't realize that billions of dollars of foreign funding has poured into Canada through these activist groups to block energy development. And we have a summary of the Deloitte report from the Allen Inquiry on our website. Oil, gas, and coal are global commodities. It's a very competitive market. So if the US, Russia, China, Iraq, Iran, or any competing commercial interest can keep our oil and gas from other parts of the market, then they get a better price and they get a better market share. So likewise, the label dirty oil was the perfect way to demarket the oil sands and push clean, so-called clean energy, making the public think that wind and solar could replace oil and gas and coal when nothing could be further from the truth, because wind and solar are entirely made from vast quantities of oil, natural gas, and coal, and they must have 100% conventional backup on the grid. So they're not energy dense. And I invite people to have a look at Robert Lyman's report, his summary of the Natural Resources Canada report, Inconvenient Facts for Climate Activists, because the real numbers show that we get huge financial revenues from conventional energy and its power and might, and we get almost nothing in return from the highly subsidized wind and solar and so-called clean tech.
There seems to be a real thirst or hunger right now for oil around the world, especially in the United States. And now the Americans, the Biden administration says we're going to be cutting back on a lot of the Russian conflict oil, but instead they're going after Saudi Arabian, Venezuelan, Iranian oil. Why not Canadian oil? We're their neighbors, and it's not conflict oil here. We're able to help out our American neighbors. Why not?
We have a report called Protest versus Green Trade War, and it takes a look at the tar sands campaign using images and messages in their own words. And it shows that there's really a battle going on between the Democrats in California and the Republicans in Texas. And so that's part of the battle. And also what's happening in the world is there's a lack of development of new resources. And Professor Samuel Farfari of Belgium is a chemical engineer and former official with the EU. And he predicted in 2017 that there would be an oil price shock by 2020 because there wasn't enough development of new resources. And people have pulled back their investments. They divested. People like Mark Carney have threatened companies with bankruptcy if they don't toe the line on climate change. And climate activists have driven off insurance companies and bank investors. So it's this lack of resources, along with the bounce back demand after COVID, that's affected global prices, driving them higher. And natural gas, of course, is also a market commodity, and it's always been subject to wild price swings. So we're impacted in Alberta, even though we have lots of natural gas here.
Let's talk a bit about fuel and diesel right now. Vancouver, I've talked to friends out there, it's like $2.09 a liter. A lot of my family in Southern Ontario, it's $1.85. Here in southwestern Alberta, it's what, $1.58? I think it just went up to $1.73. What's driving a lot of the high price of fuel right now?
Well, again, part of it is the global demand for fuel and the shortage, because there's a shortage of new resources and shortage of product in the stream. You know, if we had been able to complete TMX and Trans Mountain to BC, it serves consumers, ironically. It serves all the consumers of that Pacific Northwest area. But, it hasn't been completed. And so prices are very high there because of the lack of supply. And of course, on top of that, the carbon tax for the delivery of fuel, like millions of gallons of fuel are being delivered every day by a truck. And that truck has to be filled up with fuel that costs more money. So that money is, that expense is passed on to you.
Now, we're seeing that energy is power, and there are costs related to the energy and power we choose. Do you think there's a bit of a deception of how green and cost effective green energy is today?
Yes, the billions of dollars of foreign funding that's been promoting green energy has skewed the public perception completely. I think people should look at Václav Smil's presentation to engineering students at McGill called Energy Revolution. It's more like a crawl. And he's written about 40 books on energy. And, we see ridiculously, Germany is closing its nuclear power plants, but it's reliant on Russian natural gas and oil. It's completely compromised in the Russian Ukraine conflict.
Now, last time we chatted, we talked a little bit about Alberta coal. Can you give us an understanding of how powerful petrochemicals are?
We have a report that's called Why Renewable Energy Cannot Replace Fossil Fuels by 2050, written by Robert Lyman. And the cover image is one from an article in the IEEE, which compares the energy density of a cubic mile of oil to alternative sources of energy. And we use in the world 3 cubic miles of energy equivalent, oil equivalent energy in the world every year. And one of them is a cubic mile of oil. So you see that there are dozens and thousands of other forms of energies would be required. And in 1 year, the amount of energy contained in a cubic mile of oil for each of 50 years, we'd need to have produced all those numbers of dams, nuclear power plants, coal plants, windmills, or solar panels. And you can see that on the cover of the report. I was just going to say there's a good article by Michael J. Kelly about the energy return on energy invested in various energy forms. And one of those is that wind and solar do not return enough energy to even support basic society. It wouldn't enable society to continue.
So the return on investment may not be there. Michelle, let's talk a bit about how petrochemicals can actually help lower the cost of living. Can you explain that, how that works?
Yes, in our report, Keep Canada in the Black, we address this. We not only get the energy dense, reliable, affordable power and fuel from petrochemicals, but we also get a vast product stream of useful goods that save time, they save money, food, they save lives in a medical context. And the revenues we get from the sale of exported oil, gas, and coal finance public services and operations, and that reduces the tax burden on you. So our daily lives are also said to have the equivalent of 97 servants just because of the power of fossil fuels.
A lot of times when my wife and I make a decision, we take a piece of paper, we write down pros and cons, left and right, before we make a big decision, whether to move or involving our kids and so forth. Well, a lot of people have been doing the same thing when it comes to coal. We look at the positives and the negatives. Positives, obviously, it gets more people working, it helps the communities, which is wonderful. But the negatives, people are concerned about the Old Man River being polluted with selenium. It's destroying the landscape of the Alberta Rockies. Where do you stand on this here when it comes to coal?
Coal is the most affordable, most reliable, and most abundant source of fossil fuels in the world. And Alberta has extremely high environmental standards. So I think that the loss of coal for Alberta was a tremendous blow, not to mention that it cost billions of dollars for coal phase out, like $22 billion at least. Plus, now we're importing more coal fired power, but from where? From Saskatchewan and Manitoba or Montana, and of course some BC hydro as well. So we have to pay out of pocket for that, where before, coal is a resource that Alberta owns. Um, so now we have less choice about what to power our grid with, as natural gas prices spike. Before we could rely more on coal, and now we can't. We just have to pay that extra tab. So that's the sad irony of the NDP coal phase out campaign, that advocates like Dr. Vipon and Pembina Institute said, oh, we'd save $3 billion on healthcare costs. No, we've just paid billions of dollars for nothing.
Do you think that there's a potential that the Alberta coal plants could be reopened?
I really don't know, and I can't speak for any of the companies. I've never been in touch with them. On the companies and investors would likely be very gun shy, because it was the federal government that granted Alberta coal plants the right to operate until about 2060, and only the old plants would be offline by 2030. So, the province overturned a federal um, legislation, and that makes investors very gun shy, blow to confidence in any long term project.
Obviously, with inflation right now, people are trying to find ways to make life more affordable. And sometimes people are thinking about putting solar panels on their homes. At current utility prices, and as they continue to rise, do these systems really pay for themselves?
Again, these are subsidized by other taxpayers, and those are usually the poorer people. So the person who installs the system, they might see some individual benefit, but it's an illusion to think that this saves you money when it ultimately drains the tax pool for everyone and further burdens all taxpayers. You can see our article on the solar farm for the village of Carmangay. The Carmangay solar project's electricity is 7 times more expensive than the gas fired electricity that it displaces. And regarding the fact that it has subsidies from federal and provincial governments, a portion of the costs, about $250,000, is not covered. So Carmangay has a population of about 261 people. That comes to a subsidy from other taxpayers of $920 per person. And a similar subsidy for all Albertans would cost $4 billion. So we've got 2 or 3 other reports people should look at: electricity from the sun, reality versus fantasy, the true cost of wind and solar for Alberta, and what you need to know about renewables that the Pembina Institute won't tell you. These will fill in the blanks. And it should be noted that Pembina Institute alone has been foreign funded for hundreds of thousands of dollars to push clean energy, so-called clean energy. Don't people have any questions about that? I mean, in 2018, they got $500,000 from the Energy Foundation of the US, and the purpose was to support education and outreach to build a clean energy future. Foreign influence, and lots of funding from the federal government and provincial governments as well.
Michelle, we've seen a lot of these wind farms, especially as you drive out to Waterton, Pincher Creek area, you see the wind turbines everywhere. What kind of a financial arrangement is there between maybe the government and some of these farmers with acres and acres of wind farms? Do the farmers get, like, I don't know, maybe $10,000 a year per wind turbine? I mean, how does the actual business model work? Do you know?
That's a good question, and I don't know the details of those contracts at all. But they usually do draw in the farm community because it's seen as another revenue stream for farmers. And unfortunately, as far as I understand, farmers will also get stuck with the cleanup because the advantage, one of the indirect subsidies that a lot of wind and solar producers get, is that they don't have the same rigid requirements that oil and gas companies have for decommissioning and restoration.
So if energy costs are actually rising for residents like they are for all of us right now, are they also rising for governments? What are your thoughts?
Yes, yes. Because governments also have to pay, they have lots of buildings that they have to power, and they often try to use, they try to greenwash other investors, perhaps the bond buying market, by saying, oh, well, the Alberta government is mostly run by biofuels, or the operations are, we've got solar panels on the roof of the legislature, or whatever. But, the problem is this does send up the costs all around for operating. And then, of course, the unions have a cost of living associated with their union contracts. So they want and get more money. And, the taxpayer ends up paying and paying and paying. And we have an article on this called Taxpayer Death by Debt and Taxes, which is all about governments going into the renewables end of things.
So as life gets to be more expensive and there's more of a push for green energy, but at the same time, we're all about oil and gas here in Alberta and agriculture as well, obviously. What do you see as the best path forward for Albertans?
Well, first of all, the public have to be far more energy literate. They have to understand the implications of these. So I hope they'll look at our videos and our blog posts and reports, and they need to demand a full cost benefit accounting, because that's not happening. These things are being sold as a great way to save the planet, which is, of course, everybody's desire. But the actual costs are not being presented, and we have to stop the addition of renewables to the grid in Alberta because it will break our piggy bank. We're financing renewable energy credits for some of the richest companies in the world, and Donna Kennedy Glantz recently had an article on that. So I invite people to look at the costs of net zero. We have one of our professional engineers, a member, sent us their comments to the federal government. It's posted on our blog. So have a look at that, because you really need to understand this freight train of costs that's coming toward us fast.
Michelle Stirling from Friends of Science, thanks for joining us today from Calgary.
My pleasure. Thank you.